Hello, my name is Antoni Cimolino. I'm the Artistic Director of the Stratford Festival, and we're here today to talk about Coriolanus. And of course, we're screening Robert Lepage's 2018 production of Coriolanus, which we have on film, and we're going to be broadcasting as part of the Stratford Festival on Film series. And with us today is a remarkable person of the theater. He's not only a scholar, but a very insightful author. He's written a series of books which have just been game-changing in terms of how we view Shakespeare in the last number of years. He writes both with a great deal of detail and insight, but also a sense of freedom about the material. Books like 1599, 1606, The Year of Lear, Shakespeare and the Jews, and Contested Will. And just recently, James Shapiro wrote Shakespeare in a Divided America, which run out and get. It really is not only thought-provoking, it really examines the role of Shakespeare in so many debates that are central to the development of American thought over the last 150 years. So, without further ado, Jim Shapiro, are you there?
I am, although I'm sorry, we're not speaking across from each other at a cafe up in Stratford.
Well, some things are not allowed anymore.
That is true. Maybe a year or so from now.
Yeah. It's terrific to see you, and thank you for joining us. And I really meant what I said about Shakespeare in a Divided America. I found all of the chapters. I looked at things in a new way. And I'd love to talk to you about the end of Shakespeare's comedies at some point, Jim, because it really, it made me, I'm sorry to use such a current term, it made me really think about my sense of entitlement as to who's allowed to stay and who has to go. It was great.
Well, it's true that living in America for the past 64 years, but really the past 4 years, has made me rethink how the ending of those comedies work. And it's also made me have a greater appreciation of tragedies, including the lesser known ones like Coriolanus, or more infrequently staged, I should say. So I'm excited to be talking about that with you today.
You had an article recently in the New Yorker, which we're going to talk about later on, talking about the pandemic, leadership in the United States, and how it's related to some of the themes and situations in Coriolanus. Jim, could you just, I find this play remarkable because I find audience members will contort themselves into pretzels trying not to say Coriolanus. Can you tell us about Coriolanus?
Well, I call it Coriolanus, to be honest, and half the productions I've worked on have called it that, and you probably hear me calling it that. Half of the productions call it Coriolanus. There was a very famous talk by a scholar at the Shakespeare Association of America meeting maybe 30 years ago. And Jonathan Dollimore came into the room and announced a talk on the anus in Coriolanus, and quite a bit. And I was thinking of doing the Oreo in Coriolanus, but never got invited to give that talk. So we can call it whatever. I'm comfortable calling it whatever. And we actually don't know how it was pronounced in 1607 or 8.
There's a real complexity to it in terms of the 13 beat lines, the invective, the name calling, but actually the plot is remarkably kind of simple when you distill it. You just tell us the story a bit?
Sure. Shakespeare lives his plot from Plutarch's life of Coriolanus. He doesn't begin at the beginning of that life. He begins at a crucial moment, which we'll probably return to, which is a moment when the Roman population is rising up in protest. And that's how Shakespeare's play begins. And this is a moment early on in the Roman Republic. Coriolanus himself had fought against the Tarquins, who were expelled from Rome. And those of us familiar with the rape of Lucrece know that Shakespeare took an interest in that story as well. So Shakespeare's coming back to a moment shortly after the creation of the Roman Republic, when the political tensions and, if you will, deal-making have not fully been resolved. Who has power? Is it the people? Is it the senators of Rome who represent the money classes? And that is one set of issues Shakespeare is dealing with. The other set of issues is this foreign enemies. Rome is not the great empire it would soon become, but the Volscians and others are vying with it for power. So the story, if I had to give a 30-second thumbnail account, would be the people are rising up. They are, the threat of uprising is forestalled. Rome goes off to war, led by Coriolanus, who is triumphant, and so much so that his given name, Marcius, is changed to the name of the city he single-handedly overcomes, Corioli, and he's called Coriolanus or Coriolanus thereafter, although name becomes a crucial element in this story. Those who are patricians try to elevate this great soldier warrior to a political role, and Coriolanus can't quite bring himself to play the role of politician, to belittle himself in his eyes to the needs of the people for their voices or votes. Push comes to shove. He is shoved out of Rome, declaring there is a world elsewhere, and he goes to pursue his longtime battlefield foe, our Phidias, in Actium, and that's where the play ends. And spoiler alert, it doesn't end well for Coriolanus, who is killed by Phidias's followers. And the only thing I really left out of that narrative is we don't know much about or hear much about his personal relationships. He's married to a very docile, fairly quiet wife. The most influential figure in the life of Coriolanus is his mother, Volumnia, who is a terror and the only person, it seems, who can make him do what he doesn't want to do. So this is, like all of Shakespeare's tragedies, partly a family story, partly a political story, and it's a story about Rome, a subject that Shakespeare turned to time and again in his works.
So Robert has, of course, created a Rome for us, which is both Italian, but really seems to have the kind of constitutional gridlock that is there in Washington today, you know, the Senate offices, that sort of look of the Capitol Hill. So a play about social disorder, riots, famine, and arrogant patricians. What was it about, and it was written during a time of plague, as you point out, in 1607, 1608. What was it about that period that seemed to have those themes in mind for Shakespeare?
I think that Shakespeare was always interested in what Americans like to call game-changing moments within a political culture, as we anticipate 2020 as another defining moment in my republic's history and future. And he loved those kind of plate tectonics where a culture could have gone one way or another. And Rome, whether he was writing Julius Caesar, or Antony, Cleopatra, Lucrece, or even Cymbeline, becomes one of the places that it's possible to write about alternative political models. Shakespeare lives under a pair of monarchs, Queen Elizabeth, King James. He understands that there are limits to writing about republics and republicanism, and to write about anti-governmental protests. And probably alone among all his major contemporaries, Chapman, Marlowe, Johnson, Kidd, he didn't end up imprisoned or in trouble for what he wrote. So he's writing plays that can be read in different ways. And Coriolanus, more than any other play of Shakespeare, has been embraced by both the cultural left and the cultural right. In Germany alone, the cultural left and the cultural right both embraced it in the first half of the 20th century, some seeing it as a play about the dangers of autocratic rule, others about the need to have a strong man lead a nation forward. So I love this play. And in Shakespeare's day, it was a modern dress play, as all plays were on the Jacobean and Elizabethan stages. And to make it modern today is the right way. people come to me and say, oh, I'm really sorry it wasn't toga, a doublet and hose, fundamentally misunderstand how modern a dramatist Shakespeare was.
Jim, their famine looms large on this, starts the play in some ways, but there's a complication to it. It's not just like there's no grain. People are hoarding grain, and Shakespeare was accused of hoarding as well. So what is that all about? Why that particular question?
Yeah, we like to think of Shakespeare as the artist struggling in the gallery. He had done quite well for himself early on, certainly after he joined the Chamberlain's Men in 1594. And by 1599, he's part owner of a theater, the Globe Theater as well. He is listed among those in Stratford upon Avon in the late 1590s who has been hoarding grain. And he has barns outside of New Place, his house there. And it's a commodity, and he is storing it at a time when people are starving. And he's also involved later in his career, after this play, with enclosure, which is to say the enclosure of pasture land that had long been held in common, as the wealthier people tried to turn that into grazing land for their sheep. So there are collisions that are going on in late Elizabethan, early Jacobean culture that connect with Shakespeare's life. And in the Midlands, in 1607, really Shakespeare country is really what I'm talking about. In the communities around Stratford upon Avon, thousands of hungry people, angry people, rose up and started tearing down the fences and shrubs that were used to enclose land that had been held in common. And the authorities responded by crushing this last Tudor uprising, this Midland revolt of 1607, and then stringing up their ringleaders. And this had been motivated both by clashes that were what we would call between classes, or between the 1% and the rest. And it was also driven by dearth, starvation. People were hungry. So for Shakespeare to write a play that begins with people insisting that grain that has been hoarded be shared with them could not have been more timely or topical.
We want Shakespeare to be a bit of a saint. And so while the academic community of the last 100 years have cautioned us against reading, in the case of all writers, don't worry about their lives relative to their work, just read their work for what it is. In Contested Will, you made the point that we've gone so far in that we've disconnected the work itself from the person who wrote it. So but he writes with great sympathy at times, like about you actually like and feel for these poor people.
Well, the wonder of Shakespeare is at the same time that he is hoarding grain, he's writing some of the most sympathetic lower class characters that have ever been written. At the same time that his brother-in-law is going out to crush the Irish, he's writing with a great deal of sympathy about Essex's campaign in Ireland and the complexities of being an Irishman at this time of English subjection. So I think Shakespeare had the ability to see both sides of pretty much every issue that he engaged, even if his financial interest was on one side of that, or his personal interest, or his sexual orientation, or anything else that he was aligned with. He was a product of a grammar school education that taught pupils to argue on both sides of every argument. And that's not a bad thing. And in a divided world that we now live in, where we all have our own news silos and only hear, so to speak, out of our left ear or our right ear, Shakespeare was able to hear both sides, and he was able to construct plays like Coriolanus that you can argue is supportive of a heroic figure, military figure, who might have been a great political leader as well. And you can argue just as easily, and critics have, that this play exposes the dangers of autocratic rule. So that is Shakespeare's gift. And I suppose if he wanted to be a polemicist, he would have gone into the church and become a famous preacher or a political hack. So we should be lucky he didn't do either of those. But he was able to see both sides of every question, and he kept his cards close. I mean, I don't really know what his politics were.
Now, the one thing that Coriolanus is not is either a preacher or a political hack. He can't seem to lie. He relentlessly tells the truth. He thinks that even, showing his wounds in order to get the votes of the common person, as he's asked to do, is somehow like being a prostitute, or worse yet, an actor. And so, Shakespeare in all his works has this distrust of people who use words. But here you have a man who is being put in a position of leadership because he's a great warrior. And he says about the lower classes, oh, you want to eat grain for free, but you don't want to go to war. He saves the city, he saves Rome, and yet he turns out to be a pretty terrible leader in some ways.
Just because you're good in one endeavor, say TV talk show host on The Apprentice, doesn't necessarily mean that you would excel in a political position. And, America has faced this many times in the past. We chose Ulysses S. Grant to be our president because he was a great military figure in the Civil War. We chose Dwight D. Eisenhower, military hero in the Second War, to be our president. So there's always a temptation to have the reassuring military figure in that role. The only time I've ever taught a class where a fist fight broke out was teaching this play. And it was back in the 80s. It was not long after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And an Israeli student in the class mentioned Ariel Sharon, the prime minister of Israel then, who was accused and shown to be involved in quite horrific crimes in Sabra and Shatila in those refugee camps. And I had a Palestinian student in class as well. And this subject of a strong military leader in a political position came up. His name was invoked. And I had to help other students separate them from it getting more violent than simply a punch or two being thrown. So this play reaches deep into the things that matter most to us politically. And as you say, it's a play that is no less about acting. I mean, Shakespeare has had incredibly talented actors like Henry V or Richard III as kings. Here you have in Coriolanus the worst actor ever being asked to play certain roles, and he cannot do it. He can be himself brilliantly, but when he's asked to play the politician and to appease the people and wear a gown of humility and expose himself in these ways, he cannot manage. He can't even keep his mouth shut when he's being insulted and baited, when it would be so much better if he just stayed mum.
He has a value system that sort of drives him in that direction, which was given to him by his mother, who's, as you know, a monster. And well, that's reductive, sorry, but let's just say she's a complicated, tough woman who believes in honor and valor. And so she has a code that she's really drilled into her son. She's willing to lose many more children, but just have one that has honor. And he lives and dies by that one metric. And therefore, empathy, vision, cooperation, those things have to fall by the wayside with him.
Yeah, and we in America today are very, very aware of empathy as a crucial ingredient in a leader. And here's Shakespeare creating a leader who, as you say, is the savior of his nation, and his commitment to honor and valor is second to none. And I would only say in defense of Volumnia, sure, she's a monster, but part of her monstrousness is a function of the fact that as a woman, she is allowed no other outlet for her own bravery, her own commitment, her own values, than living through her son. And that warps her in a way that is very painful, but very powerful in this play.
So if Coriolanus is a lion, then Phidias, his kind of mirror image, is sort of a wolf, and they come together, and some of the language, oh, the noble thing, says Phidias, and had dreams about fisting each other's throats, and it's very homoerotic. And in this production, of course, of Robert's, Phidias has a lover that they're hiding the relationship within within his lieutenant, is also his partner. But definitely there's a kind of homoerotic attraction between the two, and a connection between that and the military. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. And again, it's a complicated subject to talk about in a classroom. I have soldiers in my classroom. Columbia has many returning veterans who illuminate plays like Coriolanus. And on the other hand, when I bring up the homoerotic relationship, that is, in a sense, part of military culture, which for most of history and even today is mostly men bonding with other men. And you're absolutely right. The language of this play is shot through with homosexual desire that these two men have, even if it's not conscious or not acted upon. It's there in the text. And I have students who are military or former military, now in the reserves, who get really anxious when I bring this up and ask my students to discuss this, simply because this is another uncomfortable area and another reason why we go to see Shakespeare, because he's exploring things we would rather shunt to the side instead of confronting as directly as we might. So that is baked into this martial, heroic world in which Phidias and Coriolanus are both enemies, and they love being in battle with each other and dream about their union, so to speak. And Shakespeare is very, very astute in teasing out the connections between these spheres we tend to keep separate.
Shakespeare manages to both show up the hollowness of honor and valor, and at the same time make us appreciate what a little bit of honor and a little bit of valor can actually mean in the world. Jim, this production went to Montreal. It was done by our sister theater in Montreal, the classical company, their Théâtre Nouveau Monde. And in the translation, however, once Phidias, spoiler alert, manages to have Coriolanus killed, the translation of the line, "Thou hast done such a deed as would make valor weep," didn't mention valor at all. And I kind of went, oh my God, because the whole point, I think, at that point is that, yes, valor has its shortcomings, but actually, if you're going to live by that, you really have to behave that way. And ultimately, Phidias doesn't bother. He's underhanded.
The ending of this problematic play has been tampered with in that way and in much more serious ways, because it's hard to leave things in an ambiguous way for audiences. When Laurence Olivier famously played the lead role, he was strung up like Mussolini by upside down, hanging there at play's end to symbolize the death of a tyrant, a Mussolini-type dictator. Other productions have had Phidias himself kill Coriolanus in a kind of homoerotic scene. Others yet have had the conspirators, kind of ninjas, if you will, do the killing by themselves. I think the cuts in this and the transformations and, as you say, the translations tell us a lot about the value system and how problematic any single reading of this play is, because Rome needs Coriolanus for its survival, and it needs to banish Coriolanus for its survival as a republic. And it's damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. And that's what's thrilling about this play.
You said the word Rome, and Rome is mentioned, I think, 80 some times in this text, but always by the patricians. It's spoken of very rarely by the tribunes, other than the city. I think they say Rome like 5-6 times. But who is the city but the people, they say. Now, I just want to, before we move on to the modern day in your article in the New Yorker, just talk a bit about the left-right divide in this. So you've got the common people, and there's been, famous interpretations of the commoners, the plebeians as being left-wing and poor, and the patricians being elitists and right-wing. We live in an age today where that divide is not quite so clear. You've got, people who are not wealthy, who are poor, but they're right-wing. And we live in an age where populism has really changed that left-right dynamic. How does this play in this kind of environment?
That's a really good question. And so much depends upon directorial choices and whether you're playing in Alabama or Berkeley or New York City or Stratford, Ontario. Much depends upon the assumptions the audience brings and the intelligence the audience brings to these particular issues. And I'm increasingly aware of a resistance on the part of the right in America to engage in these very discussions that Shakespeare prompts us to engage with. One of the reasons that I wrote my book about Shakespeare in a Divided America is that we can't really stage Shakespeare in the way that we need to unless we're open to multiple interpretations, even those that might frustrate or offend us. And I think your point about the mapping this onto a political moment today is always imprecise is true. Every kind of topical reading is partial, and we tend to draw out of a play those aspects that seem to speak to us most powerfully. And I'm sure once we emerge out of seclusion and return in large numbers to see plays in Ontario and New York and London, we'll be drawn to those moments of social isolation and of plague or other allusions to things that we've been experiencing, because we find them afresh and anew in Shakespeare's play, even as we find things like communication or technology in plays like Coriolanus, a rich possibility to explore these issues.
Let's touch upon the plague, the pandemic, your article in the New Yorker, but I want to do it by way of Ibsen. Coriolanus is called an enemy of the people. Ibsen ran with that title and wrote a play about a community. They wanted to keep a dirty secret about a pollution, a secret. They didn't want to acknowledge what was killing people. They wanted to liberate the town. And so in a way, we kind of are back to that, aren't we? We're in a situation where today there is this situation where thousands of people are dying, and yet we are in some level in denial.
Who is the city but the people is that ringing line from late in the play. And if you imagine it's from a radical politician that you don't respect, AOC in America, that a young Puerto Rican New Yorker, who in my New Yorker piece, I compared to Sicinius in Shakespeare's play, who is challenging the elite, who is challenging the establishment and calling into question who really are the people, and are the rich getting richer at the expense of the rest of us, and how do the political lines break down? I actually think we're living in a moment where there will be a realignment from the alignment that existed before coronavirus struck. And I think a play like Coriolanus, in asking who is the city but the people, is going to be a rallying cry for those who are going to recognize whatever political realignment does happen in the West.
It's a lot of disease imagery in the play, and you could decide whether Coriolanus himself is a kind of disease in the body politic, or whether it's the people who are rats gnawing away at. How did the pandemic or the plague at the time inform his view of that? And it comes up in Lear too. There's a lot of disease imagery. What was going on with Mr. Shakespeare in these late plays?
It's important to know that Shakespeare lived through two terrible pandemics. The first one from 1592 to 94, which took the lives of 1 out of every 7 Londoners. And the second pandemic, which struck a really terrible blow in London in 1603, killing 1 out of every 5 Londoners, persisted on and off, recurring with the return of warm weather mostly from 1603 to 1610. So all those great tragedies, Lear, Macbeth, Coriolanus, Timon of Athens, are brushed by a writer and a theater-going public that has either experienced a terrible outbreak of plague, is living through a remission period, or as we're now coming to call it, a second wave or third wave of pandemic. When King Lear turns to Goneril, his eldest daughter in King Lear, and calls her a plague sore, that is beyond imaginable today. You're just describing somebody who is a carrier of disease and a danger. When in Macbeth, Shakespeare describes a young man in a metaphor about the fate of Scotland who has a flower in his cap when he leaves his home. And by day's end, that young man is dead and the flower is still blooming. That captures the terror of plague. And Coriolanus is written almost surely when the theaters are closed. Anytime there were more than 30 or 40 deaths in London from plague, and every Thursday those numbers were published, the authorities closed the theaters. They didn't know it caused plague, but they knew that social distancing was crucial, and if you closed the theaters, that made it more likely that fewer people would die. So Shakespeare has the time to write this play, and it's written at a moment of pandemic. And you can take out of that really what you will. He's not writing a play about the outbreak of pandemic. No Elizabethan or Jacobean writer ever did. That was, in a way, taboo. But it's a play, as you say, marked by disease and pestilence and the bodies of dead men piled up and the rest. And I feel as I read this play, the pressures of living in a society under extraordinary pressure, just to a breaking point. And that too is one of the ways in which pandemic works. We're watching protests, those who want to reopen the economy on the one side and those who want to preserve their lives on the other, colliding in the streets in Michigan and in Europe as well, and perhaps someday coming to a town near where you live or where I live. And I'm sure Shakespeare would have understood this, even as he understands plays are created out of tensions and equal and opposite forces.
Your book, Shakespeare in a Divided America, looks at all different abolition, different important topics that were seen through the lens of Shakespeare over time. In this case, I feel like you could have added another chapter with what we're going on through now. Would you consider going back to that in 10 years?
Well, I have to do something in isolation. And one of the things that I'm doing is reading the 23 books about plague published in 1603 alone, and reading a lot about plague in Shakespeare's day, and also studying the realities of what's affecting Shakespeare companies like yours, like the RSC, like the Public Theater today. When playhouses are closed, actors suffer and communities suffer, but they have to close during pandemic. Nobody ever protested that, even if it meant hurting their economic well-being. The one lesson I can tell you that I've learned so far from reading about Shakespeare's age is when plague lifted, even though theaters might be seen as somewhat compromised places, playgoers rushed back to the playhouses. And they did that because in such uncertain times, theater allows us both to deal with trauma and tragedy and loss, and also to navigate towards reconstituting our communities. Shakespeare knew that. Shakespeare didn't flee. He had a home in the country. He could have moved to Stratford upon Avon every time there was an outbreak of plague. And he stayed in London and he wrote. And he knew that those playhouses would open. And it's too much to say he felt an obligation to his fellow Londoners. I don't know if he did. It could have been purely mercenary. But he was there and his players regrouped and the community very quickly bounced back.
What a beautiful way to end. May from your lips to the playgoer's ears, Jim. Thank you, Jim. Please come back. Come to Stratford as soon as we open borders and get planes flying. And it'll be wonderful to welcome you back. And I trust and hope that you're part of a full theater at that time.
Well, I hope to get back soon. I hope to see a new 600-seat theater. I'm excited every time a brilliant new theater is created for the possibilities it allows. So until then, stay safe and well. Same to all those listening.
Jim Shapiro, thank you.
A pleasure.